And Dwight Howard has even credited his first stint with the Lakers. He's back with them now, but his first stint with the Lakers back when Kobe was still playing, they did kind of a low carb experiment with that team in the late 2000s. Dr. Kate Shanahan, a medical doctor, author of a wonderful book called Deep Nutrition and some other things. She's on the vegetable oil kick now, trying to get people off of vegetable oils. The very poorly named vegetable oils. There's no vegetables in vegetable oils. It's seed oils, guys, and highly inflammatory. And so Dwight Howard says, yeah, she turned my career around because he was prone to injury. He did not play well in his first stint with the Lakers, and then got off of those processed foods and more onto real whole foods. And now he's still thriving here a decade later.
Yeah, he's had a lot of longevity, and I know a lot of people used to goof on him and say he wasn't a winner and all this kind of stuff, but I mean, man, he's had a Hall of Fame career, and he's really, I think, shown that he is a winner, right? I mean, I think people the media can run with these narratives in a lot of different ways, right? So it's not that surprising to see him really kind of change his reputation, and again, I think part of him lasting as long as he has in the league as a big man, especially as the league has changed to favor more space. Yes. Yeah. And you need to be able, as a big, ideally, you need to be able to kind of defend in space a little bit more, at the very least, keep up with some of those lineups.
Yeah, good luck with Steph Curry. So ain't nobody keeping up with that guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's some guys where you're not going to want to you're not going to want to find Dwight ISO'd on some of those guys in certain situations. But that being said, though, largely he's been able to keep up with the game, to still be effective, still be a rotation player. And I think that comes with taking care of his body. I know he does some, at least in the past, has done some interesting, very innovative, forward-thinking training work. You mentioned biohacking. I don't know if you saw the New Fit or some of that direct current electrical stimulation technology. So he's done some training involving that. And I know they probably had that at the conference. And yeah, he's taken more of an ancestral-based nutrition approach. And I think that kind of nicely sort of kind of folds into the next thing that I think is important to bring up, is the idea of periodized nutrition that we talked about in our first.
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of these athletes are still eating carbs, but they're not eating Eggo waffles, as much as the average person, maybe on occasion as a treat, but they're not eating those things. They're not eating candy bars. They're, at least in that capacity, but they're getting their carbs from things like rice, potato, fruit, things like that.
Yeah.
And, they're also utilizing the type 2B fast twitch muscle fibers a lot more than the average person. That's that hairline trigger kind of LeBron James style fast twitch style muscle fiber, right? Whereas most of us, when we go to the gym, we're using primarily the type 2A fast twitch muscle fibers, and that's going to be your typical weightlifting style fast twitch. You're not really doing it with any type of quick nerve contraction velocity and that kind of neurological response, but you are, it's the same kind that a power lifter might use, right? So those can be fed with both fat and carbohydrates effectively. The ultra hairline trigger fast twitch type 2B, those are actually only metabolically fed with carbohydrates. So that's where there's some middle ground here in saying I'm going to go ultra high carb, or I'm doing absolutely zero carb, and just kind of saying context, right? If you are someone who's going to, even an everyday person who's going to sprint, who likes lifting weights maybe fast, who likes playing pickup sports, whatever, those would be days where your body is going to have the ability to utilize those carbs, almost like if your body was a hybrid car.
Right.
But by and large, most of your listeners, especially if you're just doing things like walking and stuff like that, that would be an example of a day where it's safer to go lower in calories and probably have more healthy saturated fats in your diet, right, on those days, because that's just the energy system that you're using. So this whole idea of eating based on energy system demands, I think, is something that not only athletes can learn from, but also just everyday people too, right?
Well, look, context is everything. And this is why I'm not a fan of dogmatism when it comes to nutrition. Sounds weird coming from the guy that wrote a book called Keto Clarity. You would think you want everybody to eat keto, but actually I don't, because keto is not really a diet. It's a metabolic state. And even with those athletes that You're helping them in the off season. Maybe they're being a little more of a traditional ketogenic diet when they're not quite in performance mode. Even when they get back into performance mode and they add in those carbohydrates, again, strategically for the purposes you've already outlined beautifully, like they're still at the end of a game. If you tested their ketones, they would still be in ketosis even with all those carbohydrates. So I feel like in the keto world, we forget athletes are a different breed and they can get away with more carbohydrates because they're expending them for a purpose that's bigger than just general health.
Yeah. I think a healthily functioning body should be the goal rather than people maybe chasing measuring ketone levels or really getting, I mean, it could be HRV, whatever, you don't want to get lost. You don't want to miss the forest because you're looking at the trees or major and the minors, right? We know the presence of ketones in the body is beneficial. I know last time we talked about both endogenous and exogenous. Maybe we can riff on that again.
We like to simplify messages, and you've done a great job of simplifying very complex messages here today. But even in my book, when I talked about getting into ketosis, okay, you can be a sugar burner or a fat burner, but the honest truth is you're both all the time. Even the most vegan of all vegan people, like Rich Roll, for example. He's a very famous vegan athlete. Do you know Rich? Have you heard of his work?
Of Rich. I'm not familiar with his work specifically, though.
Yeah, got a great podcast. I listen to kind of hear the other side and
sure.
learn. And anyway, and then he, in his vegan state, is in a state of ketosis at times, low levels, but he's utilizing ketones and fat. That's the way the body works. You're going to have this ebb and flow where you kind of switch back and forth. And I think it's that switching back and forth easily, which is what makes your athletes perform so well, is they're able to come in and out, being mostly sugar burner, being mostly fat and ketone burner, that helps them perform at their best, to recover at their best, keep inflammation low. That flexibility, that metabolic flexibility is kind of, again, the holy grail that we're all looking for. We don't want to have to be tied to one nutritional way of doing things the rest of our lives. We'd like to have that flexibility to, all right, I'm going to carb up this day and then, okay, go back into ketosis a couple days later. That's kind of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think you've heard a lot of these people who kind of were maybe more zealot-like in their approach, right? People I love and respect, myself included, but people I love and respect a lot, like Rob Wolf, as we mentioned before, Dr. Kate Shanahan, Mark Sisson, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. They're sort of finding that middle ground with respect to metabolic flexibility and sort of saying, like, wait a minute, no, like, the main thing is you want to retrain your body to be able to burn fat again, and then after that, you have to realize the state of ketosis is a transient state. It's going to be higher at certain times. It's going to be lower at certain times. And that's okay if you're using the ketones. It's just a little confusing because where the diet got its namesake from was the ketones. So most people think that's the thing. But unless you're almost proactively trying to, on purpose, it's really hard to go back after you fix that metabolic machinery that allows your body to burn fat. So then as long as you're, eating real food, of course, sleeping, things like, all of your software is working appropriately, you have a little bit more wiggle room in there. So you'll see a lot of these people, like for example, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, talking about the idea of metabolic flexibility and, how, what, when, when should I eat, when can I go lower in this, higher in that, and basing it on activity level, the time of the month for, female athletes, things like that. So I think that's kind of where a lot of this conversation is growing. And I think you said it best, which is context, right?
Yeah. And I mean, even from an ancestral standpoint, those guys were like the kings of metabolic flexibility because they would go out and they would hunt and gather. If they came upon a big bushel of berries, they would grab all those berries, they would take them back to the tribe and they would gorge themselves on all those berries. Now, they would be different than the big hybridized ones we have today. They'd be a little more fit. Sweet, but still they would eat a shitload of those berries to the point that they would be out of ketosis. But because they're so well fat adapted, maybe they haven't eaten for a week because they're still trying to get an animal kill. That put them in a deep state of ketosis, but then the berries kicks them out. But they're going that back and forth. They didn't have to try to stay in ketosis. They just did through their hunter-gatherer activities going for an animal kill. And by the way, in that fasted period, that's how they were able to fuel themselves without any food is the ketones kicked in. They had stored body fat that became their energy source till they had a big animal kill, and then they just gorged themselves all over that animal and any kind of plant matter that they might have picked up along the way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and like you said, they weren't worried about getting kicked out of ketosis when they had the berries. It was like, oh no, this is food. Food is food. We need this, right? And I think that kind of also is maybe a useful conversation for your everyday person that might encompass like some of your listener base is, so sugar is, it has some anti-stress levers that it pulls in the body, right? So an insulin response, when insulin goes up, a lot of these stress hormones like cortisol, glucagon, they actually go down. So when you're craving sugar, I mean, it's sort of like when you crave salt, right? Sometimes it's very linear. How you feel is kind of a cause and effect, right? So when your system is sort of craving glucose, craving sugar, it's because you're in a stressed out state. It could be because of life stress, could be because, you're undernourished, things like that. And so that's why a lot of people do crave sugar, right? And so, and sugar is in some ways like it has that sort of what I don't even want to call it anti-stress protective lever it can pull. So if and when you do have it, I think something to be learned from the Dr. Ray Peat community is, make sure it's coming from like fruits and things like that, where there's a high nutrient load with it. Whereas table sugar is going to be, what do they call it? High calorie malnutrition, right? Or kind of like an anti like a, what do they call it? It's sort of empty and devoid of actual nutrients. It's just an energy source. It's a high energy. Its energy to nutrient load is super low. Whereas with a fruit or something like that, they're both high, right? And so I think that's one way to think about food is aim for high, not just high caloric energy, but also high energy coming from like the micronutrients in there as well. And I think if you kind of stick by that, you're probably going to make a pretty good diet of that if you made that kind of like a one rule to live by.
Well, look, even a lot of the carnivore people are now starting to add in honey and fruit. And it's only once you've kind of healed why you went carnivore to begin with. A lot of people for performance purposes, but some people have like very real health issues. I've had on my podcast recently people with like bipolar, people with other kind of mental health kind of conditions that they went carnivore and it healed them. And now they're experimenting adding little bits of fruit or honey into it to see if they can tolerate it. And I mean, literally, that's what we're all pursuing. We're not pursuing eating any one way of eating the rest of our lives, never really changing. How boring is that, by the way? We're trying to, okay, did we restore some insulin sensitivity that maybe wasn't there before? All right, let's test it. Let's see how we do. Oh, no, ooh, I tried it. It didn't work. Okay, you're not ready yet. And life is a constant N equals 1. At least it should be.
There's like two main reasons why people tend to get a lot of great results with it. Number one, like a lower carbohydrate approach that's high in protein to energy ratio, as Ted Naiman would say, can be effective in burning a lot of fat. Also, just a lower carb diet that has a sufficient amount of saturated fat has also been, especially in like a short term kind of more strict on ramp phase, really effective in helping your body burn a lot of the PUFA containing fat from the system and almost kind of resetting you. I think the other sort of triage point to make there is that part of why carnivore is so effective, at least as a short-term kind of hormetic idea, is that you're getting rid of a lot of your guar gum stabilizers, like a lot of the filler ingredients.
Yes.
You're maybe getting rid of to talk about like Dr. Stephen Gundry of the Plant Paradox for a second. You're maybe getting rid of a lot of plants that you thought had nutrients in them, but actually like maybe had indigestible fibers because it was a defense mechanism that because they don't want to be eaten, right?
Yeah, the
lectins,
the lectins and the oxalates and all those dastardly things.
Yeah, and so you notice that's why a lot of people on carnivore, they tend to shred up a lot because they don't have that. Maybe it wasn't body fat, but like inflammation, digestive inflammation going on. So there's almost kind of like as a way to. With carnivore, I tend to use that as sort of like a lever to pull if someone needs to silence autoimmune condition, like autoimmune symptoms in like a shorter period of time. And then, like you said, you kind of baseline yourself and you're like, okay, chances are it wasn't this one thing. It wasn't just X, Y, or Z. Maybe it was like the interplay of the refined sugars, with the stabilizers, with maybe these are just vegetables that are not as easy to digest that I shouldn't have as much, like a kale, for example. You heard Dave Asprey talk about